Very happy to welcome you this afternoon for this very interesting and important session. As you all know, we are living strange times. The pandemic has forced a lot of us to rethink about our future, rethink about our working conditions, about our living conditions. People have a lot of questions, and these questions also concern, I would say, the life of our organizations. What will be the future of organizations? What can we do better? And that's why I think this theme, this occasion today is a very topical occasion to go into the work of our daily work, to the work of organization. How can we plan our work better? And above all, how can we make our organizations more inclusive? What can we do to contact and to get in touch with new people, new horizons? And I think this is a question that everybody has today. And so this is why we are very, very privileged today to have with us Nina Simon. Nina is, we are connected with Santa Cruz in California. She was the director of the Museum of Arts and History in Santa Cruz, but above all, since 2018, she set up this nonprofit association called Of, By, For, All. It's a lovely name. And without any further delay, I'm very happy to give the floor to Nina Simon. Nina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jimmy, and thank you all for having me and for being here today for this workshop. Before we get started, I just want to give a quick overview on Zoom. Can you raise your hand if you've used Zoom before? Okay, I know in this pandemic it's mostly yes, although I also know in Europe there are some feelings about Zoom. So I just want to give people a quick orientation. So many of you are already using the chat to introduce yourselves, which is wonderful. If you are not seeing the chat, at the bottom of your screen, you should see an option called chat that can then open it up, and people are saying hello and saying where they're from. And so I encourage you to please join and add your name there. And I'll encourage you throughout the workshop to use the chat if you have questions, if you have a comment or an opinion that you want to bring into the conversation. We're going to use the chat. There will be times when we'll be unmuting to speak, but because there are so many of us, most of the time I'll be speaking, you'll be using mute and using the chat to connect. Now, a couple of other features that I want you to know about. One is the live transcript. So you may be seeing my words being typed out in English. If you are not, and if you would like to, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you might see a button that says live transcript or CC, or if you don't see that, it might be hidden under more. But if you would like to see the live transcript as we go, you can find it there. I know we have people joining from many countries today, and so often the live transcript can be helpful for us to really understand each other in this conversation. We will 2 times during this workshop use breakout groups. You will not have to do anything. At those times, I'll explain what the activity is going to be, and you'll be sent to a small room with a few other people from the workshop to talk with each other. And then it'll give you a warning when you will come back to the main group. You may notice that this whole workshop is being recorded, but the breakout sessions will not be recorded. So when you are speaking with others, you can speak freely and honestly, and it will not be part of the recording of the workshop afterwards. Lastly, if you would like, I would encourage you to please rename yourself. This will help in the breakouts so that people know with whom they're speaking. You can see how I've renamed myself with my name. I used my gender pronoun. This is an option to do, and then to have the name of your organization. And if you would like to rename yourself, if you click on your own little box, you should see 3 dots in the top corner, And if you click, there might be a choice for rename. And if you can't do this, it is okay. It just can be nice for people to know where we're all calling in from, especially when we get into the breakout groups. So I'll give you just a moment to do that. And I'm going to get ready to share my screen and so that we can get started. Okay, the last thing I'll note, which you're seeing here on this slide, hopefully, is, oh, where did it go? That you will be able to take the slides home with you. So if you want to download the slides, I just put the link in the chat as well for this, but they'll be made available to you after the session, or you can download them directly afterwards. So are we ready to get started? Can I see a thumbs up or a wave or something? Okay, excellent, great. And if, by the way, oh wow, Beta even found the little emojis, great. If at any point you can't hear or you can't see the slides, please go ahead and use the chat and we'll try and get you sorted as quickly as we can. So, as Jimmy was saying, today we're here really to spend some time revisioning where we want our organizations to go and how they might be relevant in this future to which we are emerging now. And, you know, I've been thinking a lot about this past year plus and how we individually and organizationally react to major cataclysmic events. And one of the things I think about is this difference between the idea that we need to change and the idea that we might want to change. I think that most of us on some level have understood in the last year that change has been required. There are some of our colleagues perhaps who are saying, we need to change. If we don't change, we won't be relevant. If we don't change, we won't be safe. If we don't change, we will not be present in the next world to come. And then there are other people who might say, I want to change. What we did before wasn't working. What we did before was uninteresting. This is our opportunity to do something different. And I think sometimes we can get in these very personal arguments about who needs to change, who wants to change. And I want to invite us today to think about instead the idea that we might choose to change, whether we need to or not, whether we want to or not. That there might be times when we say, I see how the world is moving and I see that change is something that I am choosing for myself and for my organization. And so in this session, in this next 80 minutes today, I'm going to invite all of you to spend some time with me and with each other, thinking about ways we might choose to change into the future to come. I know very much what it's like to have to choose to change organizationally. As Jimmy mentioned, I used to be the director of the Museum of Art and History here in Santa Cruz, California. And while it became a very thriving community space that you see here, that was not the way it was when I came to become its director in 2011. At the time, we had two really big problems. We had no money and we had no relevance. There were more people who knew that this museum used to be a county jail than knew that it was now a museum. The day that I walked in the door as the new director, we had less than a week of cash in the bank. And while there was no global pandemic, there was this very local crisis. What were we going to do to be able to make this museum one that could thrive? And in the board of a failing museum, this is the question people were asking. How do we get new people in here? How do we get them not just to show up and visit, but to be part of it, to be volunteers, to donate, to be members, to be part of what is happening here? And I realized that I wasn't sure about that question. I'd heard a question very much like it when I was an engineer, which is how I started my career. And people would say, how do we get more girls in here? And I've come to find that these kinds of questions, how do we get more of them in here, are the wrong questions to ask. I believe they can lead us to lazy and judgmental answers. In engineering, people would say things like this: maybe girls aren't here because they're just not cut out for it. They don't like this math and science stuff. And in museums and culture, people would say things like this: maybe those people just don't appreciate culture. Maybe those young people, maybe those people with less education, maybe those people who come from another country, maybe they just don't get what's good here. People have said these things to my face for years. And at our museum, we decided that we didn't like these questions and we didn't like these answers, and that instead we were going to choose new questions. We were going to ask, what are we willing to change to welcome new people into this institution? What are we willing to change to help new people feel like they might belong here? And so we chose to change our museum to really make it a space that was for our whole community. And we did it in three ways. First, by becoming more representative of our community so that our board, our staff, the people involved represented every walk of life. Then by partnering so that our programs were created and co-created by our community so that people saw their own stories and their own voices in the exhibits and in the programs, inside the museum and outside, as in this historical project we did with Pacific Islanders around surf history. And finally, we worked to make our museum welcoming for everyone in our community, changing the way we displayed, changing the way we created programs so that all kinds of people would come and would connect with each other as well while they were there. These changes were philosophical, but they also fundamentally changed the business of our museum. When I came to the museum in 2011, we had a shaky budget of 700,000 US per year. We had 7 staff members, and we had about 17,000 annual visitors, the majority of whom were school children and retired white people. Here's what it looked like the year I left. My last year at the museum, we had a budget of $3 million. We'd grown to 40 staff and 148,000 visitors that year. And those visitors reflected the age diversity of our county, the income diversity of our county, and they were close to the racial diversity of our county as well. We changed our museum fundamentally by making a shift from an institution-first approach, where the museum or the institution has the programs, has the objects, has the stories, and sells them to people, to instead take a community-first approach to say, who do we want this museum to serve and represent? And how might we program based on their interests, their curiosity, their work, their energy? And the way we did it so boiled down to this idea of being of, by, and for. As I mentioned, this idea that our board and staff became representative of our community, that our programs were co-created by our community, and we saw that that made us a welcoming organization for our community. Once we'd figured this out, we started to realize that we were seeing this pattern at work in other organizations around the world that were also doing incredible work with very diverse communities. And so we started this nonprofit organization of, by, for all, with a goal of bringing together organizations around the world committed to working with their communities in this way. This is our kind of cheat sheet of how these different organizations around the world are working to be of, by, and for their communities. And we're currently working with 85 organizations in 12 countries. We're all part of this Change Network program that we use to be able to support organizations in their journey. These organizations include museums, but also theaters, libraries, literary projects, historical sites, parks, science festivals, all kinds of organizations committed to doing this work. And what we see is that this work looks very different in different places. At the South Jersey Cultural Center, they decided to really focus on of, and they decided that they were going to, in their first year in this work, they were going to transition their board from an all-white board to a board that was at least half people of color, representing more fully their community. In Wales at TechnoQuest, they focused on buy, and they said, we are going to focus on creating new partnerships with people from our neighborhood who have never felt welcome in this science center before. And so they co-created new programming created by their neighbors in their space. And at the Stedelijk Museum in Schiedam, like a lot of organizations we work with, the changes they made with their community led to changes in to new programs that were created by and for new communities. Like, for example, this live online Turkish talk show that was created this past year of by and for Turkish people in their region. And what we see again and again is that there's actually this kind of secret formula that while you can make changes in the of, the by, and the for category, we see that it's most powerful to focus on of and by. That many of our organizations for a long time have been making changes in the for category to be more welcoming. We've added chairs, we've added new programs, we've added marketing, but we haven't necessarily done as much work to be representative of the people we want to bring in and to have our programs be created and co-created by them. And we hear from a lot of our members this, they say, we thought we've been doing things that were of and by our community. But when we really scrutinized it, we saw that mostly we were doing things for them rather than asking our community if these things were serving them. And so I want to show you an example of what this work looks like in process. And then we're going to start to dive into some of this as an exercise and a workshop together. So I want to share an example from a library. I don't know if we have any librarians here with us today. This is an example from a public library in the middle of the US called St. Joseph County Public Library. And they really started out noting that they were a almost all white library serving mostly white people in a quite diverse city. And they said, we want to shift so that everyone in our community feels like our library is for them. And so we challenged them to pick just one community where they were going to focus first. And they decided to focus on Latinx youth and families in their city. Latinx is a term you may have heard. It's a gender neutral term for Latino or Latina, meaning people who are coming from Latin America. And it's a term I think that's mostly used in the United States. So they said, we know there's a large Latinx population. We want to shift so that these families really feel that the library is of, by, and for them. So they started out by talking to people in this community, really trying to understand and listen and learn to what mattered most to them. And while they heard things in all three categories of, by, and for, the place the librarians felt most confident to get started was in the for category. One of the things some of their new partners said was, how do you expect us to feel welcome when everything in the library is in English and many people in our family speak Spanish first or speak Spanish only? So one of the small changes they made early on was to start to translate. And while this is a small change, it signaled to these Latinx people that they might be welcome in the library. And it also pushed the librarians to start leaning into being uncomfortable in service of the people they wanted to involve. And so they not only changed some of their signage, but they also trained their frontline staff to be able to welcome people in their home language when they came in the door. And these small changes in for led them to greater changes in by and in of. So one of the changes they made in the by category was to partner with local Latinx storytellers to host bilingual story times in Spanish. Now, the librarians could have just read books in Spanish, but they felt that that would not be as relevant and as meaningful as if they paid partners from the community as the storytellers to lead the story time. And those partners not only could create a more culturally authentic experience, but they also were connected to people to be able to bring many people to these programs. They also learned from their partners about things the library could offer that might be relevant that were not even on their radar. So for example, this is one of their partners. His name is Juan. He works at a community center called La Casa de Amistad. And one of the things Juan brought up was he said, you know, a lot of the people who come to our community center would really love to get a South Bend ID card, which is a kind of city ID card, which you can have if you don't have federal or state identification to be able to access services like housing and transportation and food. And the librarians realized, whoa, we already can sign people up for these cards in the library, but they didn't make it prominent because they didn't have many people coming in asking for this. And the forms and the process was not available in Spanish. So they partnered with this community center to start signing people up for these ID cards and library cards at Latinx-based festivals in the neighborhood. And what they found was that meant that the first interaction they were having with somebody was in their neighborhood, not in the library. And it was offering them a service that they wanted. And then also saying, giving a suggestion that the library could be a place where other services could be possible for you too. And they found that this partnership was very successful at bringing new people into the library, not just once to visit, but to actually feel that the library could be a trusted place that delivered something important to them. Finally, in the of category, in their first year of doing this work, they decided to really focus on youth and on creating a pathway for paid youth internships so that youth could be working in the library and could be connecting in their own neighborhood branches with communities coming in. This first year of work led them to start making bigger changes to how they write job descriptions, where they advertise jobs, and how they hire to be able to build a more diverse team. So in their first year of doing this work, they made changes in the of, the by, and the for category that all helped them start building a more trusted and sustainable relationship with this community, a relationship that made the library more relevant and created opportunities for deeper involvement. So now you've heard about it conceptually, you've heard a story about it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we're going to actually play with this together. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I want to try inviting you to experiment with what these ideas of, by, and for might mean for you. And the way we're going to do this is with a fantastical example. I want you to imagine for the next 10 minutes that all 57 of us work for an imaginary community center. Our community center does an incredible job serving dogs and cats. And we have now decided we want our community center to also be relevant and be a great place for birds. So in a moment, I'm going to play some music and I'm going to invite you in the chat to share any ideas you have for how we could make our community center of, by, or for birds. Okay? Does this make sense? Can I get a thumbs up if you understand what's going on? Okay. All right. I see some concern. I'm sure you can do it. I'm going to play a song and invite you to do so. Your wildest ideas on how we could make our community center of, by, and for birds. Go ahead and start typing them into the chat. All right. Great work. Thank you. And yes, I appreciate that many people here are typing not in your native language. So I really appreciate people being courageous in sharing into this and being very creative about it as well. Now, I want to pull out a couple things we're seeing here in the chat and invite some conversation in. First, I want to note, maybe people can take a moment to kind of scan through. And one thing I want to note is looking first at whether our ideas mostly fell into the of, the by, or the for category. And one thing I notice is a lot of our initial ideas are in the for category, thinking about bird feeders, bird signs, water, perches, trees, open air. All of these things could be wonderful, but we're also making a lot of assumptions about what birds might want. And I really appreciate all the people saying, hey, we got to ask the birds what would be meaningful for them. And I think that one of the things that we're often at our organization working with teams on is how do we deprogram ourselves from the idea that we know what someone who is not us might want and focusing always on for. I want to pull out a couple of and by examples I saw here. I did see some around making birds part of the team. So that could be in the of category, hiring birds. Somebody said there should be a bird director of the center. I think that's a powerful idea. So these are a couple ideas in the of category. In the by category, I saw some ideas around partnerships. It's interesting that some of the ideas about partnerships sound like they would go with birds, like having a song competition. I love the idea of birds having their own version of a singing competition in the center. I also see some ideas, though, of partnering with bird watchers or experts who study birds. And I think that this is another thing we are quite comfortable doing is when we're interested in a new community, we might first jump not to partner in that community, but perhaps with people who might be our peers, but who study that community. And I think we can probably imagine how awkward it might feel for those birds if we were focused on working with bird watchers as opposed to birds themselves. So I invite us to think about that on the by category. Um, I also just want to appreciate how many people talked about the cats and about the challenge of the cats, right? And that people had different ideas here. Some people said we should get rid of the cats. Some people said we need to provide enough food for all the cats and all the birds and dogs so that they won't eat each other. Some people said we need different spaces for these different groups. And the reason I bring this out is this happens with people too. Fortunately, hopefully, people are not eating each other, but we can't imagine that all communities come neutrally to a space. There often are power dynamics. There may be experiences of harm from one community to another. There may be trauma from past interactions or assumptions about what's going to happen. And if we are holding a space, we have some responsibility not to just say, well, the cats and birds will figure it out, but to have some active role and to make some decisions about how are we going to hold space so that it might create a community center that could actually work for all three of these. I'm curious hearing all of this, if anybody has additional reflections or questions that this exercise brought up for you before we shift to you spending time thinking about this in your own work. Is there anybody who'd like to unmute and share a reflection or a comment? Okay. Then let's go into groups. So, we've been in this fantastical world of birds and dogs and cats, but I'm going to invite you now to take it into your own real world. And in this first breakout, I'm going to put this note in the chat as well. I'm going to invite you to think about in your own work and your own organization. Where do you feel like you're strong in of, in by, or in for? Do you feel like at your organization you often lean on for, as we did with the birds, or are you quite good at partnering, or are you quite good at representation? Where have you been strong? And where might you want to grow? Where might you want to build new skills to be able to strengthen your organization? What's going to happen in a minute is I'm going to send you to a breakout room. There will be 4 or 5 people in your room, and I'll invite you when you get there to please unmute, to quickly introduce yourself, but to please focus on talking about these questions. Where are you strong in of, by, and for? Where do you want to build new skills? Audrey just did a great example of if you've been off video, please, when you go to the breakout, come to video and unmute so that your fellow partners can hear you and see you. It's always a little awkward going into a breakout. So I just want to invite and offer, please, that you just pay attention to each other, listen actively, try and take a risk by sharing something honest that's important to you, or take a risk by being a generous listener and maybe not speaking as much as you might in another space. Taking a risk looks different for each of us. So we just invite you to use these 10 minutes in whatever way is going to be most fruitful for you and for your own learning. So I'm creating these breakout rooms. I'm going to allow you, yep, you'll be able to move at any time. And we are gonna go. You've been invited to join a breakout room, so you can go ahead and you should see an option to click to join, and go ahead and go to your rooms. Welcome back. If there was something that you heard in the breakout room that was particularly interesting, made you think, pushed you to think differently, I encourage you, if you feel up for it, to share in the chat what was meaningful for you so that others can benefit from what you learned. I appreciate some of these interesting comments around different ways to interpret these prepositions, balancing the line between change and preservation, daring to leave the comfort zone, which is not easy. Oh, wow. Okay, a lot are coming in now. Talked about change and reasons for showing resistance to change. Inviting experts on particular communities rather than members of those communities. Yeah. Bringing people together along with their passions. What a beautifully put thing that is. We talk a lot about the idea of rooting the programs and the partnerships in assets rather than needs, so that you're building on something that somebody is proud of, is strong at, cares about, loves, as opposed to a lack or a deficit or a need. Jacqueline is saying how not to be the one who is asking the first question. Jacqueline, would you be willing to unmute and to share a little more about what you mean by that? I'm sure many of us might be curious.
Yeah, I'm working in the red light district of Amsterdam in one of the oldest buildings. And what I realized that it's really important to work with our communities, but I'm always the one who's asking the first question. So there was this person here in our community saying, yeah, but it's good that you are here and it's nice that you are asking questions, but it's always your question. And I said, yeah, but without asking a question, yeah, there's no conversation. So how do we start? So this is like, yeah, kip and egg, the chicken and the egg question.
Yeah.
How do you solve that?
What a great point. And, it's one of the things that we in our program talk a lot around. What does it mean to listen and learn? What matters to a community? And what we've seen is many organizations come to communities in a very transactional way. They might say, we are working on this project. Do you want to partner on it? Do you want to be part of it? Do you want your story to be in it? And we really advise starting a conversation from a perspective of, my goal is to understand what this individual values, what they're proud of, what challenges they face, and what commitments they can make. And so we're always kind of looking at, what are the questions that are more about learning what matters to that person, as opposed to learning what partnership could a partnership happen, yes or no? Because I wonder, in what you just said, and I know it's always so culturally specific, but I wonder if what they're saying is, it's your question, it's your project, it's your frame, you're inviting me into your thing, as opposed to, you're getting curious about who I am, what I might want to do, and what matters to me. And so we try to make that shift because this comes up quite a lot. That actually leads well. I'm going to bring us back to the slides for a few minutes, and then we'll go back into workshop to talking a little bit about the process that we've seen work to make this kind of shift. And this is a process that we support organizations in this Change Network program, but it's a process that you can do yourself in any way, in any time. And this is just a process we've seen be quite effective. So what we encourage in terms of starting, particularly a lot of people are talking about change, is to form a team internally for the change that is a diagonal team. And what we mean by diagonal is people different parts of the organization across and different levels of power. Because a lot of times there might be a change effort that starts in just one department, or it's only at the top, or it's only at the bottom, or it's only in the education group. And so we really see that if you're trying to make change that might be across the organization, it's quite effective to have people from different places and different levels so that it can't be siloed. Then we really say a first step is to create a vision. What would it look like for you to have an organization that was inclusive, that was relevant, that was engaged with your community? And that kind of dreaming, kind of like we did with the birds, is a good place to start in imagining in our wildest dreams what could be possible. And maybe then even looking and saying, wow, in all our dreams, it's just about 4. We have more audience, but it hasn't changed who we are. Or we have more partners, but we haven't changed who's on our staff. So it's interesting also to think about, are you dreaming in all the different ways people might get involved? Then, as you heard in the library example, we actually encourage organizations to pick just one community to focus on first. There may be many communities, especially if you're in a big city, that you feel like, or you might be a national organization, you might say, how could we pick one? But what we found is that particularly for communities who felt marginalized or unwelcome in the past, there's a very big difference between saying everybody's welcome and saying, I'm inviting you specifically. I want to get to know what matters to you. And so we encourage organizations to pick one to focus on at first, and then to build the skills to do this process with many different communities. And with that one community, you can go be present, you can listen and learn from what matters to them. And you can use that then to start to make a plan for change. And then to figure out what are the tools that are going to support you in making that change. What is the support or the network that's going to support you? As you may be hearing, it is early morning here and my child is feeding the dog outside. So if you're hearing somebody instructing a dog, that's what's going on. So this is the process that we support organizations to go through, but it's one we've seen work in many places in many ways. And a couple of notes I would just offer about it. A lot of organizations rush to start by making a plan. And they don't start by listening and learning. They make some assumptions, especially in this time around racial equity. There's been a real urgency of we need a plan now without that consultation first. And we really see that that's a mistake. We really see that you're strongest if you start by imagining what could be possible, imagining far into the future. You know, these last couple of years have been so wild. Imagine 5 or 10 years from now. What do you want the organization to look like? How do you imagine it being different? And then getting clear on what community you might focus on. And this is the place I want to share a little bit more about because this is something that often is challenging for teams to think about. And then we'll do a little breakout around it. So the question I would ask you here is, who do you see as critical to the future of your organization? You know, I think every organization, if we think about communities out there as these bubbles of people, some of those bubbles overlap, many of them do not. And every organization has some set of communities who have always been involved or have been involved recently quite well. These are people who love what you're doing, who are part of the staff, who are part of the team, who come every weekend, who when you reopen will be there the first day. These are the communities who have been with us for a long time. Most organizations also have communities they've been moving towards. Maybe you have a teen program, or maybe you have a project for a fellowship for young artists or people from a particular neighborhood or a particular country. And before the pandemic, This is really the setup we saw at most organizations. They had a core audience, and then they had people they were also engaging through specialized programs. Now, what we saw during the pandemic was a lot of organizations at first kind of collapsed in to focus on some of their longest time patrons and supporters because they were nervous that they might lose their relevance. And so they decided, let's focus on the people who have loved us the most. And while I understand this, I think it's actually quite dangerous. I think that the organizations that are stronger are ones who took an opposite approach, who during the pandemic said, let's move this way. Let's spend more energy into the communities who we've been interested in, who we see as part of our future, but who we have not been able to fully pay attention to in the past. And so instead of looking like this, I believe that after the pandemic, their relevance is going to look more like this because they've done this work during this time. Let me give you an example. One of the organizations in our Change Network is a small contemporary art center in Panama City, Panama, called Casa Santa Ana. And like many contemporary art centers, historically it served an audience of contemporary art lovers and also international artists coming through to be part of their space, their Kunsthalle. But however, they're located in the Casa Santa Ana neighborhood, which is a very working class family neighborhood, and one where they said, if we build this art center and we don't have a relationship with the neighborhood, we will have failed. So that's why they came into our program, was they had this classic problem, right? They had traditional communities they served well, and then they had these communities of interest who they wanted to involve, local artists and families in the neighborhood. And so they joined our Change Network before the pandemic with this kind of dynamic going on. Then during the pandemic, what happened? Their traditional communities shrunk. International artists were not traveling, and local art lovers were not coming out. At the same time, they saw many more opportunities for them to connect with their neighborhood than they had before, and they decided to focus there. They knew that these people were part of the future of this organization, and they decided to put their energy there. So for example, Casa Santa Ana became the first food distribution service in their neighborhood. They collected thousands of dollars in donations and they gave out bags of food. At first, those bags just came with cards that said on them things like, this is from your neighbors at Casa Santa Ana, we love you. But eventually they added art supplies to those bags as well. Similarly, with local artists, they started using their social media platform to be able to showcase how people in Panama City were dealing with the pandemic. And again, I think this is setting them up after the pandemic to have a community relevance that looks more like this. So again, I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to invite you to join your breakout and to talk about this question with each other. Who do you see as critical to the future of your community? And who might you want to move towards to build a more effective organization? So I'm going to open the breakout rooms and I'll send out that message. I wonder if there are questions or observations people would like to share in the chat. Think something that stuck with you, something that you want to bring to the whole group. Feel free to share those now. We're going to do just one more content piece and then we'll end with just questions and conversation. Yeah, I'm seeing some great observations coming in. Oh, I love this one from Inga of sometimes abandoning your initial ideas by inviting others to join in or make their own plan with you. Yeah, that really is when you're starting to shift from for to by. I also see some things about change management internally in this conversation. You know, it's interesting. Somebody says frustrating is when people say, I've never been asked, notwithstanding our great campaigns. You know, one of the things we often think about, and this is something I wrote a lot about in the book, The Art of Relevance, is that what looks like and says welcome to one person might be uninteresting or invisible to somebody else. And that sometimes we feel like we've done such a good job promoting something or doing invitations, but we're doing it in a place or in a way that the people who we're trying to reach don't hear it or may not feel really welcomed. And so I think that it's always valuable to ask, okay, for this campaign, who am I trying to reach and where are they hearing about things they care about? Who are the people they trust? Where are the places they expect to be engaged? I'm going to share one more little piece of content and then we'll open it up for open dialogue at the end here. Let me find the right window. And okay. Okay, you're seeing slide? Yeah? You're not seeing my email? Okay, good. Okay. So the last thing I just wanted to bring up comes back to this idea we talked about briefly earlier about focusing on assets. Somebody said that thing about, root it in something that that they love. And we think a lot about when you get to making a plan with a community, how do you think about it, not in terms of what somebody needs or lacks, but in terms of their strengths. Actually, I remember in October of 2019, we were doing workshops in The Hague with librarians from across Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, the UK. And I remember talking to a Dutch librarian who said that they really wanted to focus on middle-aged men who with low literacy, who are natives. And I said, okay, what do you know about these men? And what's important to you about them? And he said, well, we're a library. These men can't read. This is important to us. This is part of our mission. I said, okay, what do you know about them besides the fact that they can't read? And he said, well, I know that a lot of them are really proud of their work. They're proud to provide for their families. They have close relationships at work. And they're very proud that they are able to work to support their families. And so we talked about the difference between the idea of a program that says, can't read, this is for you, versus a program that says, want to grow closer to your children or want to advance in your job, this is for you. And this idea of rooting a program around literacy in something that somebody is strong at and wants to improve in their strength, wants to feel more proud of, as opposed to pointing out something that may feel shameful, that may feel frustrating, that may feel like you're coming, presuming what they might need. And one of the examples I loved during the pandemic of this was from the UK, from a small theater company called Slung Low. And they really got creative in thinking about what assets did they have as a theater company and what assets might there be in their community to come together. One of the humble assets they realized they had was a van that they would use to bring props and actors and lighting when they would do productions. And they realized that they were not doing productions during the pandemic and that maybe these vans could be used to transport critical supplies. They also realized that they were a grassroots group that was really good at putting on a show with a whole lot of community members. And they thought maybe we could use that same energy to be able to put on a relief effort. And so they actually became the nonprofit for their city that was coordinating all of the relief around COVID-19 in the beginning. They also realized that they wanted to not just focus on what people needed in terms of food, but the assets that community members had in terms of their creativity and their resilience. So they said, hey, we have a printer. If you send us a piece of art you're making right now, we'll print it and we'll put it up around the city. And they ended up doing this massive public art project just on street posts based on their community's creativity. And their artistic director wrote very beautifully about this whole experience. And one of the things was this, he said, what are we for? Ultimately, we're not for selling tickets. We're not for selling beer. He said, as a theater company, we tell big stories and then we make them true in the world. And he said, one of the big stories we tell is that we're all in this together, and that's why we're coordinating relief. And one of the big stories we tell is that everyone has creativity to share, and that's why we're doing this project. And I would similarly invite us to think about, as we imagine how we might revision our relevance during this time, what do we choose to change? Which communities, who might we commit to involve in the future? And what assets can we share with those communities so that we can build more relevant and more thriving organizations together? So I want to thank you for listening. We now have 15 minutes for open questions and answers. I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to invite you to put your question in the chat, and then I'll go ahead and call on some people. And if you're comfortable, we'll invite you to go ahead and speak your question out into voice. If there are no questions, you can just go out and change the world and create a more relevant organization, and we'll all have some more tea. But I imagine there are some questions. Jacqueline asks, when you're a museum, I find it difficult to become something else by working this way. You're becoming a community center instead of a museum, ? Yes, you know, when I was running the museum, there's a comment card that I kept that said, what is this, a community center or a museum? And then somebody else had written, can't it be both? And I'm a big believer in this idea that Elaine Gurian put forward of the museum of and, a museum that can be for many people and many things in many ways. And to me, what is fundamental about a museum is that we are forming connections with each other through objects, through material culture, through shared stories. And so it's not just a nightclub, it's not just a chatting space, but it's a space where we're connecting through these objects and stories. So for example, during the pandemic, I've seen museums doing things like creating exhibitions, inviting people to catalog and share their objects and stories from the pandemic time. Or I've seen organizations, art museums that are really focused on how do they support local artists during this time and encourage art making. So thinking about what is the world we want to contribute to, what is the role we can play in it, and how people might be able to be part of it. Marie-Sophie asks a question that I think connects to Peter Cole's question. How do you manage when communities are geographically far apart? And then also making the first step to community, example of migrants. I think that we think about the idea of defining communities very specifically and using 3 ways to define them: by geography or place. That can be where you are, like people who live in this neighborhood, but it can also be where you're from. So that's one of them. Another one is identity markers. So that could be about being female. It could be about your religion. It could be about your age. And then the third is about affinity. What do you love or what do you like to do? So for example, when the Stedelijk Museum Schiedam started with us, one of the first communities they wanted to focus on was young Turkish women interested in modest fashion. And so this was rooted in this affinity, this idea of being interested in a certain kind of fashion, but a fashion that's also tied in with some elements of being Muslim, being migrants, being female. And what often happens, to be honest, is that an organization will pick a very specific community. And then when they actually get to know people from that community, people in that community will say, well, that's not how I define myself, or I don't see, that's not a real community. And so often you're renegotiating how you're defining a community as you get to know people. But if you can start quite specifically, it gives you individuals to reach out to as opposed to it being very abstract. Staying on this community piece for a little bit, and then we'll shift over to talking about change, which is the other big thing I'm seeing here. Ekin asks a very good question. How do you gain insights from communities you aim to include without pushing a certain narrative, but making their voices heard? Yeah, so one of the very practical things we think about is that you should be looking to have multiple partners, and that we always joke that in any community of 2 or more people, there are actually 2 or more communities, right? Because everybody is different. And often what you'll find is, I remember once we were working with, we thought we'd gotten so specific. We were focusing on this neighborhood that there were only 300 families in, and they were all in this very specific place. 90% of them had originally come from Mexico. We thought we knew a lot about them. And then we found there were actually 3 different communities within that neighborhood, and some of them didn't like each other, and they had very different opinions about what they wanted to see the future to be. And I think that sometimes organizations make this mistake that we pick just one partner and we assume that their preferences are the preferences of the whole community. And so what we've found is that it's quite powerful if you always make a commitment to listen and learn from multiple people, and you should be looking to hear multiple things. And so when I've done projects like this, it often is not until we've talked to 5, 8, 10 people that we start to see, here is what's common and shared, and here's something that this person really cares about, or this group really cares about. And then we're going to have to decide whose preferences, whose needs, whose interests we are going to prioritize here. And that is a real choice. It's not neutral. And so for me, that comes back to the birds and the cats and the dogs, that we often kind of say, that it is useful to think about who has more power when you're deciding which community to prioritize, and can you elevate and prioritize the interests of the people with less power, because those are people who probably will not feel welcome or safe if a need that they have or an interest that they have is not met. Whereas people with more power, you can invite them to say, hey, can I invite you to be generous, to be a little uncomfortable in this space so that everybody can feel welcome here. And that actually relates to this thing about working with communities where there's a lot of conflict. First of all, if you don't have a lot of experience in conflict resolution, you should not be blindly saying, oh, we're going to do an Israeli-Palestinian project and it's all going to be great. You know, that there's specialized skills there. But every community has conflict. And so I think you have to have some institutional frame for either saying, you know, when there's conflict, we side with those with less power, or we go with the majority, or we decide. Just being able to be honest and transparent about what is your process will help people be less confused about what's going on. Okay, the last group of questions I want to play with here are all about change management. Paul asks, how can we be sure our efforts will be lasting when time evolves, or is it about starting over and over again? And then similarly, Jimmy asks how to move from individual ideas to persuade others to follow and create a group within the organization. And Sylvia says, you know, is words more important than facts and actions? How do we get to actions? How do we go there? These are all really powerful questions. I want to start with the idea of moving from individual to collective. You cannot make change alone. And so if you are change motivated, your first job is to find others in your organization who also are excited to make change. They may not be excited about exactly the same things as you, but you cannot do it alone. You will be ignored, you will be, sidelined, and in some cases you will be fired. If you can put together a group of people who start to build some power and build some support collectively with each other, you can make change. And sometimes it comes from the top, but I've seen many examples where a small group of people have just started meeting regularly to talk about their ideas, have shared, I tried this, I got in trouble, I tried this and it worked. And just creating some support can start to build some energy together. This is why actually in our program, we require you to join with a team so that it can build that power. Sylvia, I would say action is always more important than words. And I think especially in the United States, there's an obsession right now about using the right words when it comes to racial equity in particular. And a lot of organizations and a lot of white people in particular are quite nervous to do it wrong. And so they do nothing. But we are always causing some harm. They're always, no humans can interact without harm. What matters is that we are trying to take action to change things. So I would say, actually, we often say, if you're having an internal argument about the words, go with whatever your boss uses, and then get the action done. You know, don't waste your energy on the words, put your energy onto the action. And then finally, Paul asks this question about, you know, how does it sustain and grow? And I think it's different with communities versus internally. So if you're talking about building relationships with communities, actually, I have a slide from something else on this. Let me grab it. We see that there's a pretty consistent kind of progression that organizations can go through. And let me pull this up. Okay, we see that it really depends on what level of trust you have with a community. So if you have very low trust with a community, in a year, what we see often is you're basically building some partnerships on very specific projects, and then people are coming and getting involved with those very specific projects. So you're partnering with an organization or with a group of people to make an exhibition or make an event or make an archive project, and then people are coming to that event or participating in that thing, but may not trust your organization overall. But once they start to build some relationships, then you can start to see the kind of change that grows, the kind of change where partners are more involved with more relationships, where you have community members actually joining the team. And I'll note that one thing, Paul, that often happens is an organization will do one project with a community, and they'll have this first box of success, but then they drop that community and they go to another community. And so they actually squander the relationship they've started to build instead of letting it grow. And what we see is that in about 1 to 3 years, we've seen organizations have this progression where they end up in a place where there's very sustainable change, where people are really involved and really engaged and invested in the organization. And this is certainly what we saw when I was working at that museum. Now, however, while I say this is true without in the community, when it comes to internally making this change, for example, in a museum with a staff and board, it really requires being quite thoughtful about continuing to build together around the values of what you're trying to do. And I will say that, you know, I was so proud at the museum that I ran that we built a staff team that really was rooted in what we were doing with our community. But I did not always do that same work with our board. And so when they moved to hire the next director, there was a big, it created a big fight between the board and the staff, between board members and each other about what the organization was for. And I really learned from that very painfully that if the people who have the most power do not have the values connected deeply, then you may have to start over. Then things might go back. Then promises might shift. And so I think that I've become much bigger believer now in how do you build power at all levels behind the change so that it can continue to evolve from what you've been able to build. I hope everybody has a lovely evening and a great day.
Thank you very much, Nina.
Nice experience.
Bye bye.
Yeah, very useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nina.
Bye-bye, Nina.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.